I'm worried about Deltarune's story. I want to start this by saying that I'm a huge fan of Undertale and Deltarune. This isn't me trying to hate on the game or Toby Fox's work or trying to say that Chapter 5 was bad. There were things I really enjoyed. Notably the gameplay, art direction, OST, all the things that Toby normally hits out of the park, he did once again. But after sitting with it for a while and thinking about it, and especially after the most recent update, something has been bothering me. It's the direction the story is taking moving forward. Now, myself and many others had a few issues with Chapter 5's story, and the biggest one by far is that the plot did not move. My biggest disappointment with the chapter is honestly just how little the overarching story progressed. The prophecy, untouched. The knight, just more vague posting. Asgore finally shows up, and barely does anything. December still isn't meaningfully addressed in the story. Undyne has disappeared, and almost nobody in Hometown seems particularly concerned about it, even during the preparations for the festival. After everything chapters 3 and 4 set up, I expected those story threads to start converging meaningfully. Instead, it feels like a lot of them were simply put on pause for the chapter. And I know this was sort of lampshaded before the chapter came out when Toby said that it's the last hopeful chapter. I don't find that effective storytelling. Now, a big symptom of the plot not progressing forward is Susie's character feels very disconnected from the story and strangely sidelined. This was probably my biggest complaint of the chapter overall because I prefer stories that are character driven, and ultimately Susie's character moving up to this point through chapters 3 and 4 was the most compelling for me. At the end of Chapter 4, Susie seemed like she was maybe even stealing the spotlight from Chris as the protagonist of the game. She saw the final prophecy panel, she learned about the shelter, she had one of the codes, and she had very meaningful character revelations with Gerson in regards to her becoming the White Pen of Hope and controlling her own fate. It really felt like she was about to become the frontrunner in the story and a very active participant in uncovering the mystery. Then Chapter 5 happened, and none of that mattered. She did not bring up the prophecy the entire chapter, she did not seem moved by what she learned from Gerson, and she's not actively looking for the shelter code anymore. Well, she does bring up the shelter code once, but it's in the middle of the date with Noelle and very much feels like an afterthought. It is possibly even played for laughs, I can't really tell. She's indicating that she wants to go back to Noelle's house to search for the code, but ostensibly it's just so she can spend more time with her and go on another date. This makes everything she learned from Gerson last chapter and becoming the White Pen of Hope and a big driving force in the story feel very meaningless. In some aspects, it almost feels like her character progression got reset. Maybe these things will be coming back into effect in Chapter 6, but for now, Susie's character feels like she took a detour in this chapter at the best. All of the characters introduced in Chapter 5's Dark World feel very one-note and almost like they won't have very many implications on the story moving forward. The one exception to that is possibly Flowery, especially due to the code being in his soil and the extra seeds possibly implying that he'll be resurrected later. Also, the relationship that Flowery had briefly with Susie seemed quite important, but ultimately was not very well touched on. And the conflict going on in the background between Rousey and Flowery this chapter felt mostly just like more vague posting. It did lead into a couple glimpses into Rousey's character that were interesting, notably him growing a little bit more angry than we've ever seen him before, but ultimately nothing really happens with it in the end, and he does forgive Flowery and helps try to heal him before he dies. So to conclude the main story section of this video, Chapter 5 felt like it didn't progress the plot meaningfully, and it felt like a lot of the characters that were about to step into the spotlight, namely Susie and Rousey, took a back step this chapter and almost reverted from their character development in Chapter 4. Now moving forward to the deep lore problem. Now, this is where I may lose some people. I'm actually okay with not getting massive lore reveals every chapter. I don't need Gaster to appear or be referenced every 5 minutes. Theories about Image Friend, the Eggman, and all this hidden stuff are pretty flimsy already. I do find them intriguing and I love watching videos about them, but I'm perfectly fine if not every mystery does not get resolved in the game. But one thing that bothers me is about how inconsistent the focus feels on these aspects chapter to chapter. One chapter heavily implies something, for example Chapter 3 Sword Route and everything to do with the Shadow Mantle. Gaster is another example and possibly the most noteworthy example. He speaks to us directly both in Chapter 3 and 4 and then nothing in Chapter 5. And Chapter 5 was one of those chapters where it felt like the deeper mysteries of the game were mostly being swept under the rug in favor of serving the more surface level plot and the jokes. But overall it just feels disjointed and like it's just sort of making things up chapter to chapter. It feels less like a steadily unfolding mystery and more like certain pieces of lore are being randomly put into the spotlight before disappearing again. The pacing just doesn't overall feel satisfying with the quote-unquote deep lore. Now I'm going to move into briefly discussing the Weird Route, which I've seen a lot of praise for online, and I did really like the scenes that were included with the Weird Route this chapter, but ultimately I think it also does suffer from a lack of story progression. Ironically, I actually thought the Weird Route developments in Chapter 5 were the most interesting parts of the chapter, but they're also making me nervous about where that route is going. The last truly substantial Weird Route content happened way back in Chapter 2. Let that sink in for a moment. The Birdly fight was 5 years ago. Chapter 3 had the sword route, which arguably may not even count as weird route content. It may just be a way for players to discover the weird route. Chapter 4 had the one significant scene, which mostly just referenced Chapter 2. And now Chapter 5 gives us a very small gameplay section, a little dialogue, and one more scene. Now it appears that we're even skipping Chapter 6 as a whole and heading straight to the B-side of Chapter 7. And that ultimately also has me worried. That doesn't leave a lot of room for things to be resolved. I'm starting to worry that there just simply won't be enough time to make this route feel as impactful as it deserves. And maybe Toby proves me wrong with all this, and I really hope he does, because I'm such a fan of his work. But right now it feels like really the fan art is carrying the weird route. Does anyone else feel like that? Unless this all somehow is building to Sans origin story in Undertale, then maybe it's all worth it. For those of you that don't know, after Chapter 5 release, Toby added an update to the game. And what did it add? More vague posting about Image Friend, possible hints toward deaths, possible hints toward Chris losing their hand, but very little is actually said. And this immediately stunk to me. And do you know what it stunk of? Freddy Fazbear. It stunk like Scott Cawthon's writing style. And my problem isn't necessarily with the dialogue itself. I do find it intriguing somewhat, but it's the way that it was implemented after the chapter already released. And that's where my problem and my first big worry in regards to Deltarune story is cropping up. This update felt like it was responding to the community's response. Now, should an ongoing story be shaped to its audience's expectations? That's a debate for smarter people than me to hash out, but personally, I don't like it. Because it reminds me immediately of Lost or Game of Thrones. Not because the stories were identical, but because they started feeling like they were reacting to the audience speculation instead of simply telling the story they set out to tell. And one thing that has always intrigued myself and other fans of Deltarune is that the entire story for Deltarune is supposedly already written and came from a weird fever dream that Toby Fox had years and years ago, which to me sounds like an incredibly engaging premise for a game, and it's what's been really driving my love for this game and its storytelling over the last few years. And maybe this is an overreaction, but this update has given me pause to that idea. Because even if it's just deep lore implications with December, Chris's hand being cut off, or Image_Friend, why should the community reactions influence where the story goes at all? If Image_Friend was never meant to be a major character, and I am starting to believe that, that's okay. Seriously. If they're just a creepy Darkner or a stand-in, or the everyman equivalent for Deltarune, for those of you who don't remember the little weird guy in Undertale, that's perfectly fine with me. Not every mystery has to be solved for a story to be good. And it almost feels like this update was directly targeted at the theory community, specifically people who are making videos about the theories. An example that creeps immediately to my mind is Spooky Dude's video calling Image_Friend Image_Fraud. And while that's a completely ridiculous sentence to say out loud, and I feel silly even saying it, it does almost feel like a response to his video. And there is precedence for Toby changing the game based around the response and videos about the story. For those of you who were around for the initial release of Chapter 4, the Weird Route scene with Noelle initially had a very different tone implied to it, whether intentional or unintentional. Instead of the heart cracking into a bunch of red scraggly lines, it initially was a rose being depedaled, which obviously has very dark implications for the characters and for the weird route going forward. This was changed within days of the initial chapter release, and while I'm not personally a huge fan of changing content after it releases just because of audience interpretation, I do understand why that change was made, especially if people interpreted unintended implications of sexual assault. Removing that is very understandable for Toby Fox. I have no issue with this change overall, like I said. The only reason I bring it up is because it did establish a precedent. It showed that player reactions can affect the story even in subtle ways. So now with this update adding more dialogue referencing Image_Friend, I can't help but wonder if it's partially responding to the Image_Fraud memes in the theory videos that I discussed earlier. And I know that Toby Fox is a chronically online dude, so I'm really hoping that's not what it is, but it does start to feel that way. My concern going forward is I don't want Toby Fox writing the story based off Reddit posts and YouTube theory posts. I also don't want him shaping the story around Twitter fan art of Image_Friend or December. I want him to tell the story he set out to originally tell. If that means Image Friend won't be there, that's fine. Whether people love it or hate it, that's what makes stories memorable. Not trying to consistently satisfy every theory community, but telling the story that he set out to tell. And yes, I swear to God, if December shows up with dark hair wearing a red flannel and ends up being the exact punk girl archetype fan art has already settled on, I'm going to go insane. Overall, I am still very excited about the future of Deltarune's story, although the developments in Chapter 5 with the plot not progressing, and now this update showing that Toby is possibly going to be looking to the community to help shape his story going forward does have me a little concerned. And I really hope Toby stops looking at the theories on Reddit, Twitter, YouTube, because in the long run, I'd rather experience Toby's complete vision than a story that's constantly trying to keep up with its own fandom.